Thank you, Mary. Welcome. Hi, everyone. Nice to see those of you I know. And for those of you I don't know, it's nice to meet you. I'm Parker Blackman. I'm Executive Director of the LA Partnership for Early Childhood Investment. And I'm going to just do a quick overview of what we're going to do today before we get started. Here's how this is going to work. We're going to have plenty of time for a conversation. But first, what we're going to do is in a minute, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Shane Murphy Goldsmith, who's the president and CEO of the Liberty Hill Foundation. And she's going to set the context for this conversation and then introduce one of our guests, Dr. D'Artagnan Scorsa, who only has a limited time with us this morning, but we're going to make the most of that, and we're going to hear from him for a little bit. And then after he has to jump off, we'll hear from our other illustrious speakers, Maria Brenes and John Kim, who is still, he just texted me saying, I'm still getting to Sacramento this morning. I'll be there, I promise. He's going to join us here in a few minutes. So we're going to hear from them, but we're going to make sure we leave about a half an hour for questions and discussion. And since we have a large group, we're going to ask everyone to please help us in a couple ways. I'm sure you're familiar with this now. One is to just stay on mute the whole time. If people were coming on and off mute, you can imagine the kind of background noise we might have. And then if you have questions or comments, just put them in chat. I'll be monitoring the chat, so will Shane, and then that way it'll be easy for us to see who has questions and to direct those to our illustrious panelists and have plenty of time for conversation. So that's the program here. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. First, for those of you joining us for the first time, the LA Partnership for Early Childhood Investment is a public-private partnership of more than 25 private philanthropic partners, plus the public agencies that serve children and families in LA County. And our mission is to leverage philanthropic resources to blend and braid those with the public sector for the most vulnerable, lowest income families with children birth to 5 and their providers in LA County. We also are glad to be hosting this, as we always do, with Southern California Grantmakers. I really want to thank them. They're terrific partners for these quarterly meetings. And for the first time, doing this with co-hosting it with the county's Anti-Racism, Diversity, and Inclusion Initiative. And really the thanks go out to Cindy Harding with the county, whose idea it was to do it this way. And so thank you, Cindy. I'm just so glad to have all of you from the county joining us today for this important conversation. It's really important. And of course, I want to thank our speakers and our moderator for joining us. I just really appreciate you all taking the time to be here with us and to talk about this really important issue of power building. This is a journey that we at the LA Partnership have been on for the last couple of years, starting really kind of formally with the African American Infant and Maternal Mortality Initiative. It is a public-private community partnership, and I give all the credit to that for my colleague Casey Patterson and others at the county for having the grace and wisdom to say this can't just be a public-private partnership. We need to bring Black leaders from the community, in the community, to be equal partners in deciding the parameters for this initiative and for how dollars get allocated and where they get allocated in the community. And that got us really thinking and evaluating more about how do we support building power from the ground up with community partners. And as a result of that, we really thought we should tackle this topic. We should tackle the topic of power building to better understand, when we say that, what does that mean? What are the parameters for that? What are the lessons we can learn? And we should bring in folks who can bring real life examples of that. And so we're so pleased to be able to have this conversation with you today. Before we get started, the last thing is I want to turn it over to my colleague, Araceli Sandoval Gonzalez, who's going to read a land acknowledgement, and then we'll get started with our program. So Araceli, can I turn it over to you?
You sure can. Thank you, Parker. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone. So I'm going to get started. The County of Los Angeles recognizes that we occupy land originally and still inhabited and cared for by the Tongava, Tatavium, Serrano, Quiche, and Chumash people. We honor and pay respect to their elders and descendants, past, present, and emerging, as they continue their stewardship of these lands and waters. We acknowledge that settler colonization resulted in land seizure, disease, subjugation, slavery, relocation, broken promises, genocide, and multi-generational trauma. This acknowledgement demonstrates our responsibility and commitment to truth, healing, and reconciliation, and to elevating the stories, culture, and community of the original inhabitants of Los Angeles County. We are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these ancestral lands. We are dedicated to growing and sustaining relationships with Native peoples and local tribal governments, including the Fernandeño Tatavium Band of Mission Indians, Gabrielino Tongava Indians of California Tribal Council, Gabrielino Tongava San Gabriel Band of Mission Indians, Gabrieleño Band of Mission Indians, Kesh Nation, San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, the San Fernando Band of Mission Indians. Thank you, Parker.
Thank you, Araceli. So now I'm so thrilled to turn this over to Shane. Not only because Shane is a fabulous human being, but also because Liberty Hill, under her leadership and with her colleagues, they fund a lot of community-based organizing and power building and advocacy work. So I can't think of somebody better to help to ground us in this conversation and lead it. So Shane, I turn it over to you. I thank you, and I welcome you also providing your thoughts to help kind of provide some context for this conversation. So thank you, Shane.
Thank you, Parker. Hi, everyone. It's so good to see you. I can't see all of your faces, but looking at the list of names, it's wonderful to be in space with so many people that I know and have heard about, and I know care deeply about these issues. I'm Shane Murphy Goldsmith, President and CEO of Liberty Hill Foundation, and I also serve as co-chair of the board of Southern California Grantmakers. So thank you all for being here. I'm super excited about this discussion. For those of you who know about Liberty Hill Foundation, it will not surprise you that power building is my favorite subject, and Maria and D'Artagnan and John are some of my favorite thinkers and doers around power building and social change. And, you know, when I was thinking back to, you know, my early days when I was a baby organizer and just kind of learning the basics of what power building means and what power means. And I think power, you know, can sometimes be a scary word. I think maybe because so many of us have experienced the abuse of power, and we're all familiar with the saying that absolute power corrupts. But I think there's another side of that coin, which is that powerlessness also corrupts. And also just you know, for me, the definition I learned of power is basically being able to get someone to do what you want them to do, especially if they don't want to, but even if they do. And I think it's as simple as that. And we also learn in organizing that there's two basic forms of power. There's organized money and organized people. And the exercise of those two different types of power looks really different. And I think sometimes, you know, that the process of building people power and wielding people power can be messy and unpredictable and maybe uncomfortable for some folks. But we all know that we can't do anything without power. As individuals, as institutions, we know that as funders, a lot of the reason that people listen to us is because we represent organized money. We walk in the door. Sure, we're smart, but there's lots of smart people. Why do people listen to us more than others? We know it's because of the money that we have, and that's, you know, that's sort of a transactional power. But the process of building people power in the absence of organized money, you know, is a daunting and massive task. And the good news is that organizers across Los Angeles for the last few decades have really been honing this craft and Whereas I think for many years, funders had difficulty understanding what it is. How do you know it's working? What does success look like? As funders, how do we measure it? I think the sector has come a long way, especially over the last 10 years, in really defining metrics so that funders have some way, if it's important to them, to have a way to sort of assess and know that success is, that progress is being made. Because of course, the things that power building organizations go after, like Liberty Hill's big initiative to end youth incarceration as we know it, like that's not going to happen in a grant cycle, right? So, you know, funders need sort of benchmarks along the way, and there's going to be wins and losses along the way as well. So the good news is, for those of you who may not have funded power building before, you'll hear from folks today that there were some really specific ways to understand and measure it and invest in it. The other thing I want to say that makes me super excited about this conversation is that getting service providers to organize and build their power on behalf of the communities they serve is kind of like the holy grail in organizing. Like, for the 25 years that I've been doing this work, everyone's always like, if only we could get the providers, because there's so much untapped power there, because they have such legitimate, incredible proximity to folks who are directly impacted, but they have more of the sort of institutional power and resources that is needed to uplift their voices. And government really relies on providers, and they know they do. And so providers can have a tremendous amount of power. So the idea that the partnership and that all of us here today would be really thinking intentionally about investing in building power on behalf of kids and families and providers, I think could be a major game changer. And the last thing I'll say before I introduce the panel is that one of the things that I think is most beautiful about power building, I mean, we all know it's about collective power. We all know that with building collective power well, we can accomplish massive things like ending youth incarceration as we know it, ending oil drilling in our neighborhoods, creating an office of anti-racism in the county. Whoever thought that would happen? A through G classes and in schools. You know, an equity lens for investments by LAUSD. Like major game-changing wins have been brought because of the wielding of collective power. But I think the other really amazing thing that we don't talk enough about is the personal transformation that happens for people in the process of building power with their community. And, you know, we work at Liberty Hill, we work a lot with young people who've been in jail, and support them and encourage them and give them resources so they can go speak to the media and elected officials and government officials about their experience in youth jails in Los Angeles to really transform the system. And, you know, once a young person has had that opportunity to be told that their story is important and that they don't have to just be, you know, just stand in the face of these massive power structures and cower, that they have power, that their story matters, and that their truth is important, that changes folks forever. And so never again are they going to sit in front of, you know, some person and allow themselves to be beaten down by the power dynamic. They are always going to be fighting back. And that's sort of the real lasting. I mean, we can change policies all day long, but at the end of the day, we need a populace of Americans who are always struggling for what's right for them and to get the needs of themselves and their communities met. And I think that's the sort of untold story of what organizing does. And I apologize if you can hear my dog barking. Nothing I can do about it from here. So I now have the wonderful pleasure of introducing Dr. D'Artagnan Scorza, the Executive Director of Racial Equity, Los Angeles County's Anti-Racism, Diversity, and Inclusion Initiative. We call it ARDI for short. Dr. Scorza, you know, you're one of my faves. We recently, actually, for those of you who want to hear more from Dr. Scorza, you can listen to the Liberty Hill podcast, where he was one of our very first guests. You can hear him talk for like a good hour, and it's super brilliant and incredibly moving. But for now, Dart, why don't you tell us, you know, introduce yourself however you like, and we'd love to hear really how you define power building from your personal experience, you know, in your own life, as well as in the work that you've done over the last few decades.
You got it. Thanks so much, Shane. And thank you all so much for having me here with you all today. It's always an incredible pleasure to be a part of these spaces and to be a part of these discussions. I'm always honored really by the desire to keep us moving in a direction that's advancing not only racism, but helping us really lift up the voice of folk in our communities. And so again, I'm D'Artagnan Scores. I lead the Anti-Racism, Diversity, and Inclusion Initiative. Thank you so much, Cindy and Heather from my team who hope to coordinate this, with me being here today. And really, I'll just tell you, this conversation came from a lot of internal discussions that we've been having in the county. So I think it was for us in many ways a natural fit, because in ARDI, our goal is to advance equity, especially racial equity. And power building really is a key to doing that. So when I think of power building, I think you heard Shane say it earlier, right? I think it's really straightforward. It's really finding a way to organize people and organize dollars, ultimately to, either get something you want, give somebody else what they want, or get people in positions that'll help support what it is that you're trying to aim for. But at its core, I think power building is ultimately about people, or rather creating a process whereby people, individuals, communities are able to take control over their lives, over their environments, over their conditions, right? So, often with government agencies, those of us who work in, in the county and in the city and other institutions, those of us who work in government agencies are often designated and given the responsibility to carry out certain functions. That could be the delivery of services. It could be, providing for care for a family, issuing, resources to folk. And that perspective of sort of always doing for folk is an important sort of function that county governments serve. However, the challenge that I think emerges when you have folk in government agencies who are in the position to provide services, or in some cases interventions, is that there can be a paternalism that takes place and takes hold. And that paternalism, right, assumes that we think we know what's better for people. It assumes that we think, that they may not have enough information to make the best decisions in their lives. It might assume that we are best positioned because we have more resources to do for others. And that paternalism can often get in the way of what it takes to actually solve issues in communities. Because fundamentally, true power building is grounded in the idea that people have the solutions themselves. People in communities already know what they need. Like, we don't, I grew up in South LA, and I grew up in both Watts and Inglewood. And you didn't have to tell me, right, that at the time when I was growing up that homelessness was an issue. I could have told you that because that was my experience, right? That's what I went through. And so I could have said back then, or much like the people who are living in these conditions today can tell you now, here are the challenges we're facing, and here's how we believe they need to be solved. And so that's sort of driving solutions by those who are most affected by the problem and those who are ultimately most in position to solve that problem, I think, are really, really, really important. In sort of a pure sense, it's really making sure that we take a step back, that we move the voices of those who are on the periphery and are marginalized to the center, to where decisions are being made. That it's not just bringing them to the table, but it's creating the table around what those folk believe need to drive change. And so when I'll turn it back over to you here, Shane, in just a second. In ARDI, our charge in many ways is to work to correct those imbalances of power and to address structural racism and structural inequities that continue to serve those who are in positions of power at the detriment and at the expense of those who are in community, or those who are who may need to drive solutions. And so it's not just about us coming up with ideas and innovations that we believe in the county can solve problems, but it's really moving the voice of those with lived experience, lived expertise, those who are in those conditions to the forefront of a solution and an idea before it's made. And we've done that in some ways that I'd be happy to provide some examples on a little bit later. And then finally, it's really about making sure that when that voice is at the table, that those voices from those in our community who are most affected by the issues are both identifying problems, prioritizing them, and defining them. They're also part of the decision-making process, and they're presenting solutions and to help drive the support and resources that are needed to address those issues. And so I'll pause there and turn it back over to you, Shane, as we move through this discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Scorza. You know, I'm sure you don't get tired of hearing how thrilling it is to both have your role exist in the county and have it be filled with you who you know really comes from organizing and really does believe in the power of people, and you really see how government can advance that power, but how government can obviously also stand in the way. And so you mentioned that you've got some examples of how you're doing sort of aiding and abetting power building in your role in the county. So we'd love to hear about those.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll tell you a couple of things. Before I came to the county, I founded and led the Social Justice Learning Institute, which had a mission dedicated to building power with those in communities who are most affected by issues through research, training, and community mobilization. And I'll tell you why we did that. We ultimately used participatory action research, community-based participatory research, and other methodologies to help our young folk in community identify issues and then take the things that they would identify and make them actionable, to push for the passing of laws, to identify where the needs were, so they would then be able to mobilize within their communities to push, for example, for one of the successful things we did, which was to get rent control in Inglewood, or to get housing justice for our communities. So just coming to the county, right, it was obviously a different experience. And I think bringing that experience and recognizing the importance of implementing power building practices, I think we've been able to do that in a number of ways. So first, in our prevention services work, in our prevention services task force, one of the things that we've been able to do is through support from Philanthropy, actually, is compensate folk who have lived experience and lived expertise and make sure that they're able to participate in our task force and in our subject area tables, our subcommittees, essentially, with voting power, with the ability to not only influence and drive and direct the decisions that are being made, but to make sure that one, they have the resources they need to participate, and then two, make sure that they have the power to actually vote and influence and inform. I will tell you, there would be many times where folk with lived experience or expertise in our prevention services task force would say, we need to rethink this entire concept. I'll give you one good example. We were talking about what prevention and promotion looks like, right? So prevention is, stopping negative life outcomes from happening, and promotion is enabling positive ones to happen. And we were trying to develop some sort of framework. And me, my academic brain wants to build out these models and build out all these things, and sometimes overthink things, right? So we had some of our folk who lived experience who are like, look, by doing those models, you're sort of reinforcing these hierarchies. Let's take a look at the shapes and the ways in which we are even visualizing what we're saying, and let's rethink it. Let's, use a circle as a format, or let's think about concentric circles, and let's think about the relationship between the things that we're saying. And I think that sort of interaction totally redirected where we were headed, and it allowed us to conceptualize a model that made sense based upon folk from our communities thought made the most sense, right? And I think it's stuff like that that can help drive change. I think the other thing that we're seeing emerge, not only in our prevention work, but also in our in and throughout our departments, is a recognition that stakeholder sort of leadership, engagement, and agenda setting opportunities are really important. So we have a stakeholder engagement work group that is dedicated, that Cindy and Heather and others help to lead, that is dedicated to actually identifying some of the most effective practices for making sure that folk who are most affected by the issues can help drive decisions within departments. You have a Department of Public Health that has efforts underway in their Center for Health Equity and others to do this work. Are which Casey is here today to share more about as well, the African American Infant, Maternal and Mortality Initiative, in collaboration with First 5 LA, is leading significant work. The Alternatives for Incarceration Initiative with the Care First Community Investment Committee is helping to drive investments to the tune of what will now be around $300 million annually in community services, right? So you have the work that we're doing in our equitable county contracting efforts, where folk from the nonprofit sector, folk from community-based organizations, folk from business sectors came together and told the county, hey, this is where you're making it difficult for us to contract, and we need to alter how you're going about contracting, certainly while taking into consideration issues like risk and some of the legal requirements that may come down from the federal government. But really the equitable county contracting processes have been driven by folk and community. And look, I'm not going to say any of this has been easy. I'm not going to say that there haven't been moments where it's been difficult to figure these things out, but I think that's the journey, right? That's what's supposed to happen. And that's ultimately what a process will get us. It'll get us connected to, it'll ensure that folk from communities are connected to power and are in a position to change and alter the very conditions that are affecting their lives.
Woo. So into it. I wasn't ready to unmute. Dr. Scorza, do you need to wrap up and depart now?
I can take a few more minutes.
Okay, great. So I think one of the really important things about the way this panel is constructed today with Maria, John, and Dr. Scorza is that it really illuminates what I think of as a very LA brand of organizing, which is these inside-outside strategies. I've never worked anywhere else. I don't know how it is anywhere else. I think LA is the best. But I do think because we tend to have a more progressive electorate and more progressive electeds in LA, this inside-outside strategy is really critical to, it's not like they're all against us. And so we have to figure out just how to like get in the door. So it requires a different kind of strategy. So, you've been on the outside, you've been on the inside in many different ways. And would love to know what your reflections are on sort of how to do the inside outside strategy effectively as an outsider. So sort of taking what you know now and reflecting, like, what advice would you give your organizer self now knowing what you know?
That's a really good question. I think one of the things I would start with is, if I were sort of, looking back and sharing what I know now with myself back then, I would have said that it's important to actually, understand the relationship between the balance of power, and also recognize sort of what my role was and what my role is. So, for example, to look for opportunities to engage, but to never sort of give up the ability to put pressure on those who are in positions of power, right? So it's always recognizing that, look, if you're in the county, you're still a target, right? Like, you're still someone who can be, subject to pressure, but it would also very much be a matter of communicating with folk, right? It's like, hey, let's have sort of a line of communication that allows us to strategize in a way that ensures that when you're on the outside, you're able to navigate the internal challenges, the policies, what the barriers are, where the pain points are, where the pressure points are. So that way that pressure can be dedicated and targeted to where those pain points might be. So instead of just sort of, just sort of randomly, aiming for everything, right? You get really specific, you get really targeted, you figure out sort of where, with my allies, where might I need to engage to help move that issue forward? And I think that sort of strategic decision-making and engagement and communication is really important. I'll say, to your point, Shane, about being here in LA, I think there's been a sea change in a number of ways over the past decade, largely due to what organizers have been doing, right? I think organizing and passing Measure J at the time, You have the work that was done around parks equity, right? There's been a lot of work that's been done in community to help make sure that the county itself, the recognition of the county as an entity with a lot of power that affects a lot of people's lives, right? I think years ago, the county wasn't on folks' radar like that, right? Now it is in a big way, and I think that's important to note. And it's because of folk in the philanthropic sector that shift has occurred. It's because folk in philanthropy have funded power building organizations, and they've increased the evidence base and the evaluation rigor, and they've also worked to make sure that we've been able to tell stories about the successes that have been done. When I was doing work with the Brother Son Selves Coalition with many of your organizations and others, right? We were organizing with LAUSD, organizing with the county to eventually get what's now known as the Department of Youth Development. Right? There's a lot of work that have been done in Brother Son Selves, organizing at the state level with the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color and partnership organizations like Policy Link and Liberty Hill and others, to really push for changes in state law around school suspensions, zero tolerance policies, right? But it was working with those legislators, working with their staff to know exactly like, who do we need to reach out to? And I think it's largely recognizing that sort of deep and authentic engagement is what helps us make progress. And it's not always going to be perfect. It's not always going to be easy. And in fact, often is very difficult despite some of our best intentions. But it's getting us to a place where we are able to balance that power in spaces that are typically dominated by folk from the county, but also making sure that people in the county are able to bring their expertise to the table. So I don't want to be dismissive, right? Because folk in the county, they know things and they know them pretty well, and they have been doing their jobs. And these folk in the county are some of the most hardworking people I've ever met in my life. And I will tell you, some of the folk in the county family are folk that I will rock with any day, because they are dedicated and they are committed and they are focused on equity and they want to do the right thing and they want to be down for the cause. I have seen people do work in a way that often might, be surprising, right? You might think, oh, they're in the county, they don't care. That's not true. I've never found that to be the case in my experience. I'm not suggesting there are problems. I'm saying that I find that people are dedicated to doing this work and they want to figure out how to do it the right way. And I think that's part of where partnering with folk in community is really, really, really important. So I'll close by saying this. We are on a journey and there's still much more work that needs to be done. Again, things are not perfect, but I know that we're working hard in ARDI to lead by example through our Black people experiencing homelessness work. We're, intentionally centering community. We're bringing our wisdom keepers to help support and advance the work and to help lead that work, to help steer and guide that work. We're funding that work in partnership with Philanthropy and also with county resources, working very closely with our staff and our team and bringing people on board who are dedicated to this work, who have the right, sort of approach and mindset to doing this. And in the end, with our mission and our vision to make sure that everyone thrives, but to end structural racism and its consequences, power building is key to what needs to happen to advance this work, because we not only cannot do it alone, but we need people who are most impacted by these systems to drive decision-making and to help advocate for equitable policies, processes, practices, and the use of resources. So I look forward to continue this conversation. I thank you again, Shane and team, for having me here, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Scorza, for spending some time with us today. And now I will shift over to bringing in Maria Brenes, who's the outgoing head of Inner City Struggle, and John Kim, who's the head of newly named Catalyst California. I only see John, but there's Maria. Good to see you both. Two of my faves, Liberty Hill and both of your institutions go way back, I think, to the beginning. I think we're like cousins in this work, if not siblings, and certainly two of the biggest brains and change makers in this work. It's funny, I was just thinking about, D'Artagnan was talking about, the county, and I was remembering when we sort of as organizers discovered the county. It was like 9 years ago or 8 years ago or something, when we started to see some really exciting people get elected. And I remember I called John Kim and I was like, what is the count? Like, how does it work? What happens over there? We need to do some research. There's some opportunity for huge change in the county with these electeds, and no one's really been paying attention. So much organizing was focused on the city for so long. So it's exciting to see how far everybody's come in terms of really seeing the county as a a place where we can make big change for young people and for all of Angelina's. That is just one of many topics upon which John Kim is an expert. So let's start with, we heard how Dr. Scorza defined power building. I would love to hear what both of you have to add in terms of how you think about and define power building. And why don't we start with Maria?
Thank you. Thank you, Shane, and everyone for this opportunity. I'm very excited to be here. And I want to respond first by presenting a few slides. Again, Maria Brenes, and I am with Inner City Struggle, and we have been a community organizing institution in the east side of LA for nearly 30 years. I have been with the organization for over 20 years, and our focus is intergenerational power building with young people, young adults, families, and voters to bring people together to realize their power and affect change. So I'm going to share some slides just to illustrate more around our perspective when it comes to power building. And I mentioned community organizing. And for us and for the ecosystem, the movement building ecosystem that we have been a part of, it's the primary tool used to affect change. And one key element of organizing is building power with people that don't have it and have historically not had it, often because it's been systematically denied to them. Power, privilege, and oppression are all important things to address and analyze in organizing efforts. And you have the illustration here. This is community organizing, power building 101, one of my favorite illustrations that, when we come together, the little fish can be more impactful and more powerful than the big shark or the big fish, the bigger fish. So community organizing, and that's why Inner City Struggle's mission has been focused on this core strategy. So the purpose of organizing, my slide is not going to the next piece. But the purpose of organizing is, again, to advance change, to advance social movements. And if folks are welcome to share, an example of a social movement in the US or globally, where people came together and made a change. And you can do that in the chat, just to share some examples. Okay, I'm gonna turn to this because it's not moving. So what are some current or historical movements or campaigns led by people of color that made a major impact in the US or around the world? And feel free to share some of that in the chat. So the purpose of organizing is to win concrete changes that improve people's lives, alter the relations of power between decision makers and people, and impact and broaden people's worldview around the conditions that are impacting them, their communities, their families. What are those material conditions? What are the root causes, the historical ties to those conditions? And what can we reimagine for the future? Like, what is the world that is possible when we come together and we fight for our aspirations, our hopes, our dreams? And the other piece is, to build power by forming permanent organizations. Shane and Dr. Scorza talked about, some of our longstanding partnerships and collaborations and coalitions. and the impact that those have been able to make, whether it's at LAUSD or at the city or at the county or at the state level. Those would not have been possible, and that leadership development long-term would not have been possible without investing and supporting and fueling permanent organizations in our work. Okay, so understanding power, this is a process that when we engage with our, thousands of members that are part of inner city struggle, when they first become involved with the organization, it's grounding them in what is power, why is it important to discuss power? And for us, power in our understanding is by coming together and having the ability to influence and or determine decisions toward a desired purpose, and to control our own and others' circumstances. That is very key in understanding what is power. And, and to talk through with everyday grassroots people, whether they're, 16-year-old high school student or an elderly community or resident, it's important because it's looking at where and how resources are distributed, definitions, discussing definitions of what is right and wrong, and analyzing public narratives of who we are and who we were told we are, and disrupting that in terms of who we can be, and defining and controlling that narrative. And then the next piece is looking at currently who has the power in our communities to make decisions that impact our lives. I know that, over 20 years ago when we started our work in educational organizing, because we saw the school to jail pipeline and how adversely and how negatively it was impacting our young people and had been for generations, we had to look at, well, who can change this? Who has the power to change this? And in our community, the majority of people didn't know there was a school board and didn't know the level of power in decisions they had. And so it was analyzing, researching, investigating, and doing a power map. So we could understand, like, if this, when we identify our goals, who do we need to engage and pressure to have them agree so we can make a win that significantly changes material conditions for our young people. So that is a very important part of understanding power. And then asking, why do they have power? Are they electeds? Are they influentials? Is it the money they had? Engaging in that part of the conversation. So given that, given who has the power and why they have it, how do we then demonstrate power? What are the strategies? What are the activities? What are the tactics? Because as we've seen in history, like our little here on the corner shows, people power can be greater than the power of people in power is the power of the people has shown to make such an impact in our nation and in our communities. So different forms of people power that we engage our base with. There's economic power, boycotts. The UFW Great Boycott is one that we often point to, that forced the farmers to finally come to the negotiating table with farm workers around a living wage and better conditions. And it's an ongoing struggle. Legal, whether it was Mendes versus Westminster here in California, or Brown versus Board of Education, when people organize and take their fight to the courts, that is a part of a strategy for building people power. Direct action, a strike, young people demonstrating, hundreds of young people demonstrating at LAUSD is what finally ended in punitive school discipline and willful defiance as grounds of suspension that for decades, over suspended Black and Brown youth, API youth, LGBTQIA youth, youth with disabilities at numbers that were alarming, staggering, criminal, and it was young people marching, testifying that finally ended that policy in LAUSD and made it the first in the country to do so. Electoral, political, organizing, voters, flexing muscle at the ballot box, as well as being able to elect our candidates of choice is another strategy. And the media and imagery and narrative, as we have seen in the last 2 years around the racial reckoning in our nation, is so powerful to advancing narrative and to advancing a change when it comes to racial justice. And what are the results? The results of exercising people power. And so it's the direct action, it's the strategy that then pressures people in power to make commitments around policy change. This is an example, the DREAM Act. I mean, I grew up in a time in California when Proposition 187 passed. California was a very anti-immigrant state, and we saw that manifest in, voters unfortunately agreeing to deny undocumented people public education, public health services because of organizing, because of the strategy in building power. Now we have a state that is much more of a sanctuary state for undocumented students, immigrants. Cultural change is so key as well, as we've seen with the fight and debate around what it means to be a family and rights to marriage. And then, of course, the fight that inspires the work that we do at Inner City Struggle through the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and young people, sitting at desegregating, in forcing the conversation around segregation at the lunch counters, in the buses, and helping to end de facto segregation in our country. So I can come back to an example more locally around what it took to win a major institutional change in LAUSD that has set a different course for so many students of color. But I wanted to ground, the question around power building, what the purpose is, how we engage in those conversations at the ground level, and what it looks like in terms of strategies and outcomes.
Thank you so much, Maria. That was maybe my favorite PowerPoint ever. I could watch those little pumping fists all day long. Thank you for that. And just such a great overview. I mean, I know it's sort of a one-on-one, but it's really quite sophisticated. So thank you for sharing that. And the thing that distinguishes Inner City Struggle on this panel from the others is that Inner City Struggle is every day on the streets, at the doors, organizing people, recruiting people in. And, I think we're all very familiar with to some degree with sort of the results of organizing, like, the policy change and, how do you get there? Figure out the policy, figure out the strategy to win over the elected. But what cannot be forgotten is the day-to-day work recruiting members and developing their leadership. It's not just about strategy and sort of mobilizing that base, it's recruiting them into this work. And whatever, questions or discomforts any of you may be feeling, folks sitting in their houses every day are feeling the same way. And so to really bring them into this work is its own hero's journey. And just hats off to Inner City Struggle for the tremendous work over many decades, bringing in young people and families. John, what do you have to add in terms of a definition of power building?
Well, hard to add much, given the extraordinary experts that have already spoken. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Shane, and the partnership and the other speakers. What I'll just maybe do instead of trying to add more material here is to sort of cap it mostly for philanthropy and others who are newer to the space, not to those who have been in it. And there are several here that have been in this work around how to fund, resource, and partner with power builders. But for those that are at the newest to this conversation, and starting at the highest level, power building and its growing popularity in your industry can seem like the latest trend. It could seem like the latest bandwagon, a shiny new tactic. But the truth of the matter is that power building is not new. It's not some untested theory that philanthropy is now giving credibility to. In fact, the truth of the matter is philanthropy is actually late in the game when it comes to what is probably historically the only mechanism that we've seen to actually bring forth the power of those with the least institutional capital, whether it be political, financial, social, and to actually make real change for their communities. It has been not only time-tested, but resilient across time and across sort of regionality and political environments. It's, as Maria kind of encouraged us to think about. I mean, we're talking about, Gandhi and Mandela and the liberation from colonial rule. We're talking about Dr. King and the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. We're talking about Cesar Chavez and achieving working better conditions and respect for farm workers. The immigrant rights movement, moving California from Pete Wilson, who I recently saw on a Southwest Airlines flight, so he's still haunting around here. Pete Wilson, moving us from Pete Wilson to the, health coverage for all undocumented immigrants in California. It's also how groups like ICS and Community Coalition and others have really moved the second largest school district to live into equity a lot more, and I'm sure we'll get into that as we go. But it's the only way that we've seen through time and throughout many places that we've been able to force change from institutions that were built to invisibilize or extract labor from people of color. It's just the latest name for something that I would say at some point in all of our lives inspired us to be in this room today. You, for some reason, were inspired by some power building or organizing effort to make change. And this is sort of why you're here in this conversation. And so, as a later arrival, it does not mean that you have less credibility, less franchise, less need to be in the conversation because, this is going to be a thing that has been happening for generations, will need to continue to happen for generations. It's not like the fourth quarter of the game, right? It's actually the first quarter of what really can happen here in LA County and the state of California. When I took over my organization, when it was called the Advancement Project California, it was already a policy and political powerhouse, mainly because of leaders, the founders like Connie Rice and Molly Munger and Steve English. Also, I had people like Kim Patillo-Brownson and others to work with. These are all extraordinary leaders. But when we took over, we made the decision that our big bet on transforming systems was not going to be about supporting powerhouse leaders, but about supporting and working alongside grassroots organizations and power building efforts for some very tactical reasons, right? One, when you work with power building organizations, you actually get smarter solutions. I cannot tell you the number of times I've been in the room with those with political power or financial capital who come up with the dumbest solutions to the problems we face. There's always the good story, right? Where there was an elected official that was told about a rash of shootings, unfortunately from youth to youth, this violence that was happening, and they were pulling the guns and storing the guns in trees. And this not so bright elected official decided the solution was to cut down the trees. So time and time again, when you get power clustered in too few minds with very limited eyesight, you get dumb solutions, and power building is a way to open up the conversation and you inevitably get better solutions. So power building is smarter. Power building is more politically sustainable. I've seen extraordinary leaders come, make change, and then whether or not they, get another job, get ill, move on and retire, and the thing dies after they've moved on. And so it is more politically sustainable to distribute, to disperse the effort across many people, across many generations, so that you actually could do the long-term work to not only get the win, but to implement and move it forward. And power building has in its sort of very nature, its own accountability structure. Something that I'm sure you all in philanthropy struggle with, as many people in policy organizations and government struggle with. Where is our accountability? How do we know that as we are moving this conversation forward, we're doing right by the people we're supposed to be doing work for? And power building has its own accountability structure built in, because you have thousands of people in the conversation that can hold you to account, to say, hey, this is great, but this is where we're messing up on. And so power building for us, tactically, the reason why I moved Advancement Project California, now called Catalyst California, into the space of really working more concretely with power building is because it's smarter, more politically sustainable, and has its own accountability structures built into it, which is why I think it's a phenomenal time for philanthropy in a broader way to get involved in power building. So with that, let me hand it back to you, Shane.
Thank you, John. And that's a perfect segue to my last question for both of you, which we can start with you on, John, which is, what is your advice to philanthropy and folks in the public sector in terms of how they can support power building, particularly in this sort of early childhood space? John, and then Maria.
Sure. Let me actually, Maria, do you want to go ahead first?
Sure. So to help answer the question, I'll briefly share about the A to G for All campaign in LAUSD. I have a quick picture from 2005, which was when the initial win happened, and then there was a follow-up in 2015. So those are just some of the pictures with the young people that led the campaign and or at the forefront of organizing and direct action to hold LAUSD accountable to this issue. And it was an issue that had, unfortunately been under the radar for decades. The fact that, Black and brown youth that were the majority of LAUSD student population were systematically barred from accessing the A to G course sequence of classes, which are the 15 courses needed to be eligible for UC or Cal State with a C or better. And it was the work of grassroots organizations like Inner City Struggle, Community Coalition, and others that uncovered that schools located in neighborhoods with higher concentrations of Black and brown youth had less access to these courses. They just didn't exist for the majority of students. So it was really luck that led a young person to be able to graduate college eligible. And when we surveyed our community here in the east side of LA, thousands, the majority said, as a young person, their goal was to go to college, or for a family, that was their dream for their child. That was for, immigrant families, that was the reason they had come to this country, for mobility and opportunity for their children, and it didn't exist in their community. So we had the data, we had the moral resolve, the moral authority that came from our base, and we created a debate because these unjust conditions had been normalized, and it was controversial. At the time, the district, the Board of Education did not agree that we needed to raise expectations and make A to G mandatory. But it was the young people, the families that were committed, that were relentless, and thousands. We marched, and the young people demanded that they be allowed to choose their future and that have it be chosen for them. And ultimately, after years of this work, we forced LAUSD to make A to G mandatory for graduation. And it has expanded opportunity access. It has forced LAUSD to create more structures for college learning and career opportunity and theme-based education to open up pathways to get to the goal of college-ready graduation, and reallocated resources. And as a result, we've seen more students graduating, more students from our communities going to college, and there's still more work to do in that area. And it was an ongoing struggle. 10 years after, we had to have LAUSD recommit because there was movement at the district and at the board to do away with the A to G for all because of the challenges of, supporting more students to successfully finish that track. And, because of the long-term leadership by institutions, by the community, by leadership to be vigilant in not just securing the initial win, but monitoring and being a part of the implementation at the grass tops and the grassroots level has been essential for this long-term change. And ensuring that not only are students having access, but more supports to be able to successfully graduate ready for college if that's what they choose to do. So I think, from the perspective of inner city struggle, from the perspective of myself, in that time period of inner city struggle, evolution and growth, I think funders investing long-term, multi-year, and allowing us to have the flexibility to pivot, to experiment, I think has been essential, not just to the success of our organization, but to the impact that we have been able to make. So I think those are essential elements to the role that foundations can play is not just the short-term outcomes, but how those incremental wins are essential for longer-term change and needing to stabilize and ensure the institutionalization of this work.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that story. It's definitely one of the best stories of a huge organizing victory here in LA. And I think it's a great one because, most of us here are probably thinking, well, yeah, duh, of course, every kid, who goes to school should have access to the courses that are going to give them eligibility for Cal State and UC system. But people had to march for that for years. I mean, something that probably we all think should be taken for granted, people really had to fight for. And it's important to remember that, when I talk to donors and funders and everyday folks about this work, it's sort of often I get the response of like, well, did you explain it? I mean, can't you just like sit down and have a conversation and then they'll understand it and they'll do it? And all I can say is apparently not. That things that we know are right and that we think should be taken for granted actually do require quite a fight. It's easy to forget that when those of us with the privilege in our everyday lives, we don't have to fight for those sorts of things. So I do want to turn this over to questions from our audience, but John, if you have a quick thing to add, that would be great, and then we'll open it up.
Okay. Yeah, just a few points of advice for the field as you're thinking about power building in the context of early care and education. It's important to think about this as a ecosystem approach. There are many levers, tactics, and capacities that all need to work together in unison. It's critical to start. The first doorway should be organizing, that it's the most critical element of this ecology. All things flow from that, and that you have to acknowledge and honor and properly resource the fact that organizing is a science and art that is not nearly compensated enough. So you have to have an ecological approach Organizing should be the starting place. If you don't have good organizing, you really see people fake the funk. And just to be honest with you, there are people out there that say they're organizing and they're not really doing it. And they become no more than social media thumb activists that can quickly become detached from realities on the ground and not accountable to making real steady change just by calling things out. And so organizing is a rooted place to start, but by itself, all alone, without other supports, it's a hard place to make change from. And so the thing I love about organizers, what's inherent to who they are and what they do, is they know that no one single person or no one organization can get the change all done by themselves. And so they're very good at working in partnership and alignment. You will actually find, as you come into this field, that you might find much better collaborators when it comes to organizers than you've ever found in other sectors. But you have to show up with trust and building trust and earning trust. You have to show up with respect for not just the organizers, but their constituents as well. You got to put in the hard work to step back and learn and listen a little bit, and then come in with real supports so they can help move the needle. There are these other tools like policy and research and communications and narrative, and Maria's talked about that, campaign strategy, and of course, resources. But all of those things need to be provided in a new way. You have to relearn how to provide those supports. It can't just be like, hey, we did this research, we know the truth, let's put it out there and have the organizers follow that. No, actually, some empirical research needs to be ground truth, needs to be rooted in the fact that, as D'Artagnan said, there's lived experience, and those both need to be weighed as experts and expert ways to look at the question. So all of those other levers need to be relearned in terms of how you provide them. I'll also say this, it will feel different to you all because it is different. You will need to relinquish control. The way this works is not, hey, we have a really clear idea about what needs to change, and we need to get you guys to do that. That is a sure, fast way for you to fail. You need to actually co-design what the targets are, how to get to those targets, what's the strategy, and actually move with the power building experts and the community organizations, and in some ways share power and control. You will be picking up different types of risk from the grant making you've been making before. There are risks involved in any strategy. They will be different. And so you need to be open to learn and to roll with those risks in a different way. And then finally, it'll be different because you will have to change who you think experts are. It's not going to be those in academia. It's not going to be those. I feel interesting because I'm wearing a white button-down shirt. That's because I'm in Sacramento today. But it's not people that normally wear white button-down shirts. Okay, it's people that are actually in the field, on the ground, doing the hard work. The last thing I'm going to mention now, specifically to ECE and power building, because I did do the work to present to get my talking points ready, so I'm going to get them out there. Is that power building is desperately necessary in this field. Around young children and early care and education. Right now, this field, having worked in it for over 15 years as an organization, it's predominantly filled with service providers and bureaucrats. And that's great, but that's like trying to sit down for a meal with a two-legged stool, right? You're not going to get there. You're either, it's either not going to happen or it's certainly going to be very uncomfortable. And so what really this field desperately needs is community organizing and power building organizations to be that third leg of the stool so that you really can start moving change and really moving what kind of supports and investments we make for young children. It's not an easy tactic in terms of organizing itself. You can't organize 4-year-olds. I mean, you can barely organize them to take a nap, let alone fight the power. And so you can't organize the constituents themselves. You can't organize parents of young children because, as many of you know, that is a really bleary-eyed, sleep-deprived period of your life. And so it's hard to pull them from that saying, hey, let's do this organizing effort. And so I think that to get into power building for this arena, this sector, there is a lot about educating and organizing the current groups. The current organizing groups and service providers about what the possibilities are and how we could fight these fights together. There's going to be a lot of funding and technical assistance that's required. There will need to be some innovation because it's not as though parents of young children all congregate at a relative, like at a large level. The system is widely disseminated, and so it's hard to, we're gonna have to figure out some innovation about how to organize people, and we're gonna have to do some hard work and some real work to partner with labor, who has made real inroads in organizing the worker side of the equation, and that is not a 1 or 0. It's not a differentiating side. Oftentimes, the actual workers are lower income women of color who also have children. And so we need to figure out how to work in alignment and unison, not only with what's right for the children, the service providers, the parents, but also with the workers themselves. And so there's a lot of opportunity, but it's going to demand some innovation and some real hard work and thinking to get into this. So I will now pass it back to you, Shane.
Thank you, both John and Maria. So now we'll open it up to questions and comments from our participants. You are welcome to write stack in the chat, and you'll be called on in that order to share your comment, or you can put your comment or question in the chat and I will read it aloud for our panelists. And just while you're thinking about that, I will summarize kind of what I heard, which in terms of recommendations to funders, which is multi-year, flexible support, adequate support, to ensure that organizers can do the full scope of work, really listening and being open to their perspectives and being willing to relinquish and share power and control. So let's see, we've got some stackers already. Well, Parker. Oh, okay.
Well, I'm happy to relinquish the floor to others if someone else wants to pop a question or something in stack. But while I'm waiting, thank you, John, Maria, Shane. I could talk about this all day. This is so exciting. I want to sort of follow up on something you raised at the very beginning, Shane, about service providers, and something you were saying. Well, both of you, John and Maria, so all three of you. I think it is a real challenge in the early childhood space because you have so many service providers, and they're there for good reason, right? We need home visitors, we need childcare providers, et cetera, and yet that's very different. So, how do you think about introducing the idea of power building and organizing into those kinds of organizations that may want to do it? So not only from an expertise, right, capacity and expertise perspective, but also culturally. Like those organizations have been around for a long time, a lot of them. And so the culture of being a service provider is different than being inner city struggle, right? And there's no judgment in what I'm saying. I want to be really clear. It's just apples to oranges. So what advice would you give in thinking about if there are organizations who are raising their hand and saying, yes, we want to get engaged in organizing and power building, how would you support them in both the capacity and expertise and that culture change? Or would you just think about it differently?
Well, I think one important strategy that funders can support is coalition building, alliance building between movement building organizations and service providers. I know this is work that we've been a part of with Catalyst California at the state level through the Whole Child Equity Partnership that's bringing together organizing institutions like ourselves, service providers, labor, policy advocates, a broad spectrum of entities that are tied to and care about early childhood education, particularly for our highest need children and their families. And so I think, and that's a statewide, but at the local level, I think there's an opportunity to further cultivate and build capacity for coalitions and alliances that can impact, whether it's at the county level or at district levels or at the city level, impact policy, resource allocation, the equity debate, even though, there seems to be more attention to this idea of equity implementation and getting, government to truly authentically invest in equity, which is to get the resources where they're needed the most. is still an ongoing fight and an ongoing debate. I mean, we've been fighting LAUSD for over 10 years, and we've been successful. $700 million have been allocated to the highest need schools, but that's an ongoing fight that we have to make sure is constantly invested in. So I think there's an opportunity there. Obviously, you know, like in LA County, so many service providers are providing equitable services, right? Services to our highest need families, and how we merge their expertise and their base with a power building movement building strategy. I don't think anyone can do it on their own. I think it's cultivating these networks and this ecosystem that there's an opportunity there to invest. And, you know, whether it's at the city council or at LA County, I think there's, you know, because of leadership that's there right now, we can't miss out on this opportunity to win real policy change and resource allocation for our children.
Yeah, when it comes to service providers, I think, you know, it's important to understand their context, their budgets, where they get their resources, and what might be required in order to step into a space that often demands real political courage, right? And so service providers who get many of, you know, big part of their budget from contracts, potentially from the institutions that they may be pushing up against. I think if philanthropy is hoping that they step into it, you can't just say, hey, you know, grow a backbone and start fighting harder. You got to actually help them shift their financial picture so that it's actually organizationally responsible for them to do so, right? And so I think it's important to take a holistic approach to some of these organizations and not just say, hey, let me just add an appendage to your very large organization that's an organizing power building unit and assume that's going to be enough, right? Because that little appendage may be wildly outrun by a large contract from the government that you're actually pushing against. And so I think you're going to have to help them get to that place by understanding the larger picture. I also think that, you know, we work very closely with a lot of service providers because I'm a guy and my team are people who love the weeds. They love to see let's dig into it. Like what actually is working, what's actually makes this hard, how can we implement, how can we not implement? But as service providers, I think they are very clear and close to the weeds and the things that aren't working in the bureaucracy. They need to also learn and build relationship with organizers who may be starting from a place of like, yeah, the weeds are important, but really what is the transformational change that we need to make? Right? Not just the transactional ones. And so there has to be a space to create and a trust to create that nexus between transformational and tactical change. That's sort of part of the cultural change I think you may be talking about, Parker.
Thank you both. It's really helpful.
Thank you. So why don't we go to Freddie and then Kim, if you can both ask your questions in succession, and then we can have John and Maria respond. And then if we have time, we'll end with Casey's question.
Yeah, just thank you all. I'm just really energized by this conversation. I'm Freddie, First 5 LA. Many of you know we've been inside this work for a while and work with you all in different capacities. So I'm really just energized by this. But I wanted to say a few things. It's like we are become more clear about our role around alignment of intention of these networks. And so it's thinking about how do we help folks come together and say what's important in our community right now as a form of as an important step around power building. So it's like when we're asking for resources, are we aligned about where we want to go and what? Anyway, so that space around conversations between and amongst folks, I think, is really critical. And the other thing that just on this last, I'm curious what everybody thinks. Just on these last comments around culture change. You know, I've been in these conversations around early childhood and power building for over a decade, and like the thing that I think we're doing is like helping folks have the space to imagine a future for their young children. So what that looks like is like thinking about how we raise our children and unpacking some of the assumptions underneath that. So years ago in an East LA meeting, I remember a Mexican woman immigrant, she goes, oh, you know, the reason we have this data, right, increased child abuse and neglect is because Mexicans don't know how to raise kids. I'm like, okay, let's unpack that, you know? And, you know, that's stayed with me since then as an organizing principle. It's like, okay, I get how you might think that there's a lot there, and that becomes an opportunity to dialogue with the community and really think about like what and how we're doing it. And so then that connects to the service providers, because I think some service providers are like, oh, we just provide services in a vacuum. I'm like, no. As a my sister's raising a kid in LA, right? And so she was interested in nonviolent parenting, as a lot of people are, right? And so she goes to, well, I'm not gonna name any names. So she gets some training. It's problematic. It has some racist underpinnings, right? And so it's difficult to navigate, right? In terms of the assumptions being made on Black and brown body or on this population level data, that then you're like, oh, like this isn't okay. So as folks in the system, we have a responsibility, I think, to think about those deeper theoreticals. So I get in trouble sometimes because I'm like, oh, you're too in the clouds already. I'm like, well, someone needs to do it, because these are problematic assumptions that we're like watering them, right? And so things like Latinx parenting, or folks who are experimenting with like, okay, how do we take child development science knowledge, apply it and discourse with it, is what I'm organizing around now. Does that make sense? Like the ability to imagine a new way to liberate. And so I'm like, how do we do that, right? Because it is a very unstructured, it's much less structured than the K through 12 system. Anyway, so I just wanted to share that and sort of invite sort of reflections on that. It's like that, to me, that's the space that I hold, is like, how do we imagine how we want to raise our kids in different ways, And that's kind of a lot, right? We don't want to think about it that way, but we're being told, how and why and all that. And I thought, Maria's story was really great. It's like, this is about how the dignity and respect we want for our children, right? That and the vision we have for how we want them to be raised. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Freddie, for grounding us. Actually, let's have Kim's question, and then Maria and John can respond to whatever you want.
Thanks again to John and Maria and Shane for joining us. This has been just a really fantastic conversation, so I'm super appreciative. I think my question is really about how to think about leveraging and connecting to some of the other broader racial equity work that is moving and that has momentum. I think it's noteworthy that D'Artagnan's set of priorities that were approved by the County Board of Supes includes Black infant mortality. And that's the first early childhood sort of incursion into this space, but also thinking about what will it take in order to align interests with older youth who have been leading the charge in terms of disparate punishment, suspensions, expulsions, that type of work, and to actually create a cross age group youth movement that actually includes the young side, but also locks arms with older kids as well.
Maria, do you want to go first?
Yes, because I think my response connects to both Freddie and Kim's comments and questions. And I think that's a very important perspective that you raised, Freddie, in terms of child development and the support that our communities need in that trajectory, and not from a deficit point of view, right? From an assets point of view. But, in my experience organizing families, it's so important to validate, while at the same time, there's openness to learning. And I think that's why this work, and it connects to what you're raising, Kim, this work, the intergenerational approach, I have found to be very, very important, because generations challenge each other in very critical and important ways, and push each other to see things differently, especially when it comes from a place of love and respect. And that's what we've seen between our young people and the families that we work with. It's been our young people that have challenged our members, our older members, around the school to jail pipeline and the criminalization that they experience in their schools, and have then ensured that we have parents and families who are the staunchest supporters to ending punitive discipline, to cutting the school police budget, because they are listening and having those conversations with young people. Young people challenging our older community residents around their intrinsic anti-Blackness. And those have been very important conversations that have led to inner city struggle taking very solid and important positions when it comes to racial solidarity. And so I think, challenging and reimagining, to me, where that has come more strongly is from this intergenerational approach. And I think, that's something that we should think about when in the context of the field of early childhood education as well. To reimagine systems, because they're all connected, from cradle 0 to 8 and beyond to 24. That's our lens. They're all connected. So reimagining them together, I think is important.
I think you should take us home, Shane, because we're at time, and
Okay,
I could
thank
talk
you.
more about some other stuff later on in terms of connecting to other racial justice efforts.
Yeah, well, thank you all. We are at time. So much to say. Please encourage all of you here to follow up with any of us if you're interested more in the sort of metrics or the strategies or the funding practices. This is all of our favorite subjects, and we're happy to answer those questions. But for now, I just want to give so much appreciation to all of you who showed up today, and to the folks who organized this, and especially to Maria and John and D'Artagnan. Parker, anything else you need to say?
Yeah, I just also want to echo that, and thank you, Shane, for not only moderating, but for your own additional wisdom in this conversation, and Maria and John, and D'Artagnan and Absentia. I could listen to the three of you talk about this, the four of you talk about this all day. If you're interested in continuing this conversation, this is something that we at the partnership are leaning into. And I've talked to some of you already about it, but if you haven't been, reach out to us, because we want to and are planning to move forward with supporting organizing and power building in the early childhood space. And we need collective wisdom. We do not pretend to have the answers on this. We are tapping folks like Maria and John and Shane and Freddie and others so that we can make smart decisions in partnership with others about how we can support power building in early childhood. So thanks again to everyone for being here today, and just looking forward to continuing this conversation and this work. Have a wonderful rest of the day and week, and we will see you soon. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.